Hey, Mr. G, why is today's class on video? Because we're talking about race. So I'm putting it on video for a couple of reasons. First of all, this may be very uncomfortable for some folks, and I recognize that. And so if at any point you're saying, this is too much for me, you can leave the classroom, the Google Classroom. You can take a break from this. You can then access it via your Google Classroom. I'll post it, and you can watch it at your own pace, maybe even in little bits. You do have to watch it. It's going to be really important that we all are using the same terms, and most of this is going to be about just vocabulary, just making sure we understand what one another mean. But if you need to take this at your own pace, you may. The other reason we're putting it on video is sometimes when people are hearing something, they're hearing it through their own lens, they're hearing it from their own perspective, and that can cause people to misunderstand things. And so it's good to be able to come back and say, is that really what I was told? Is that really what I was taught? Oh, here it is. It's on video. I can identify, where I misheard that. So we are going to be talking about this. And you may be wondering, is it okay for us to even be talking about this? This sounds like such a serious topic. Is it okay for us to discuss this in class? We're going to be reading To Kill a Mockingbird. It's a book about racism. And so if we didn't talk about race and racism, that would be like reading Jack and Jill Went Up the Hill and not knowing what a hill is. And that sounds like a ridiculous example, but guess what? I grew up in the Midwest, which is very, very, very flat. And I honestly, when I was a little kid, didn't know what a hill was. And so I didn't understand Jack and Jill Went Up the Hill. And I don't want you to have that experience. So as we read To Kill a Mockingbird, I'm going to make sure that we know how to talk about it, that we've got the same terminology and we're understanding it in the same way. Also, addressing racism is mandated by the Oregon Department of Education and the Central School District 13J. So my employers, the state of Oregon, says we have to do this. But this isn't just a professional mandate for me. It's a moral imperative for me and for you. In other words, it's the right thing to do for me to be teaching you about this, and it's the right thing for you as a student to be learning about it. That being said, I recognize that this is uncomfortable. This is uncomfortable for different people for different reasons. There may be students of color here in the room who right away are feeling uncomfortable because they recognize that there's a potential danger that they could be tokenized. And to be made a token means that somebody will look at another individual and say, that individual represents their whole group. And that's deeply unfair, but that's something that happens. People look at another person and say, they represent their whole group and put all that weight and pressure on one individual. And we are not going to do that. Don't worry. You can imagine why that's so unfair. If somebody were to look at me and say, he works at Central High School, and I'm trying to judge Central High School. Are they good at basketball? Well, he's old and slow, and his shot's not very good. He's a decent passer, but that's about all. So I guess their basketball team stinks. Would that be fair? We can all recognize that would be unfair, and yet we do this to people of color often, where we say they represent their entire race. And so that will not happen in my class. And also, there may be students who are white in this class who are worried that they're going to be made to feel guilty. Please know that is not going to happen. That is not the intention, and that is not going to be the product. We're not going to do that. So let's start with this. You are not the problem. If you are willing to learn, you are the solution. A lot of the stuff we're going to talk about is difficult, it is heavy, and it's going to kind of feel depressing as we go through it, but I promise we will come to a hopeful place at the end, and there will be time to discuss this as a class, to process this, to work through this together. But we've got to kind of power through. And so even though the video doesn't allow for a discussion in the middle, if you've got questions, you will have to wait. At the end, you will get a chance to process this. Now, I mentioned that as we are moving into To Kill a Mockingbird, we're going to be talking about other things besides race. We're going to be talking about sexism. We're going to be talking about potentially ableism or homophobia, some other isms, right? So why are we starting with race? This is important. One of the common ways to deflect from uncomfortable conversations about race is to bring up other kinds of discrimination, like sexism, ableism, homophobia, classism, religious bigotry. These are all valid concerns and worthy of conversations. They are not more or less important than race. These all intersect with race and cause different kinds of privilege and oppression. If somebody is in more than one group, because remember, you all have so many identities. If somebody is, for example, white and female, they're going to have a different experience than somebody who is black and male. And they're going to have a different experience than somebody who is Latinx and disabled. And they're going to have a different experience than somebody who is Asian and able-bodied. And they're going to have a different experience than somebody who is Asian and gay. And they're going to have a different experience than somebody who is, Southeast Indian or Southeast Asian, Indian, and wealthy, right? So these different systems intersect. And we do need to talk about all of them. That's totally valid. However, because race tends to be the most uncomfortable to discuss, when we start to bring those up, race disappears from the conversation. So if we're going to seriously attempt to tackle race and whatever, we need to start with race. Race and whatever that other thing is, not the other thing instead of race. So we're starting with the hard thing first. So what is race? Race is a made-up category for organizing people. It's a social construct invented for the purpose of theft. So a little bit of history here. The people who invented race were not evil. They were not bad people. In fact, their motivation to invent race came from their desire to be good people. Let me explain. So, the people who invented the modern concept of race, as we understand it now, were people from Europe who got onto ships and they were traveling around the world conquering other lands. And when they would get to these lands, they would say, we need to extract something. We need to take something back with us. But they also were good people with values and morals. They knew theft was wrong. It is wrong to take from people. The first big goal for them was actually spices. So they were going to Indonesia and Malaysia, and they were getting these spices, and they knew, hey, just taking the spices away from these people or forcing these people to grow these spices for us, that's wrong. So how could they live with themselves? If they were good people, how could they do this? Well, they got in those ships, they went back to Europe, and they said to their scientists, hey, these people that we found look different from us. And what are you going to do about it? And their scientists said, we can help. We've got this theory that these people that you came across, their differences are caused by inferiority. They're not as good as us. In fact, they're not even people. And the people got back on those ships and went, this is great. We can now take from people because they're not people. So we're not doing something bad. In fact, maybe we're even doing something nice. We're putting them to work. We're giving them jobs, right? They didn't feel that what they were doing was wrong because they felt that they'd been told that they were superior because of this made-up idea. Race doesn't exist in any scientific way. A scientist would not say, oh, yeah, I can look at your DNA and see your race. Race is a whole bunch of characteristics that got mashed together that are culture, which is a social construct itself, and religion, which is a social construct, and physical characteristics, which might be biological, but they're not biological in any kind of clear way that identifies them with any particular race. These were arbitrary, and they were specifically chosen by the group of people who wanted a justification for what they were doing. And so, good people made up this concept of race out of racism. We'll come back to that idea. So, some people look at this now and they say, well, if race is made up, if it's just a social construct made up for the purpose of theft, maybe we could just ignore it. Maybe if we just stop believing it, it'll go away. And that's not the way social constructs work. Social constructs persist. Language, for example, is a social construct. And we can't just say, hey, if I decide that all words mean different things than what you think they mean, and I speak in gibberish, then that'll be fine, right? You would not understand me. I'll give you another example of a social construct. This is $1. This is a social construct. We don't exchange these because we need paper to write on, right? We exchange these because we believe that they have value. We've decided together that they have value. And if one person said, we'd all be better off if we just didn't have money, so I'm just going to give all mine away, it wouldn't make money meaningless, right? Money would still have impact on other people's lives, regardless of one person's desire to ignore it. Social constructs have impacts in the world. And so the idea of race, even though we've made it up, affects people's lives. And what we really need to confront is racism. Race is the child of racism, not the father, according to Ta-Nehisi Coates in the book Between the World and Me, which you will read some chunks of later in your education here at Central. So this is a really important idea to understand. Race is made up because of racism, not the other way around, right? The people first decided we need to feel superior. Let's create this concept. Now, what is racism? This is where we get into a lot of trouble. Because when people say something is racist, they mean different things. And so the other person hears it and says, oh, I think you mean this, and it causes conflict. So it's really important that we decide as a class, this is what we understand it to mean. Now, there is an old-fashioned, a traditional definition of racism. And again, these are not because these are bad people, but the people who came up with this definition, even the people who didn't like racism, had this definition, which is problematic. It doesn't really work. The older definition of racism is that racism is the intentional harm caused by prejudice, discrimination, or antagonism directed against someone of a different race based on the belief that one's own race is superior. There's a lot of parts there, right? So notice the intentional harm. So racism is the intentional harm caused by prejudice, discrimination, antagonism directed against somebody of a different race based on the belief that somebody is superior. Okay, here's the problem with this definition. Who got to decide intent? Who got to decide whose intentions define something as racism? Since white people have had more power for all of this country's history, they got to decide. So even when there was harm, see the harm? Even when there was harm caused by prejudice, discrimination, or antagonism, the people in power had the authority to say, nah, that's not racism. And the people in power were white. So that's a white supremacist definition of racism. It lets white people decide what's racism, which is a problem, right? So here's our contemporary definition of racism. Notice the differences. It's not the intention, it's the outcome caused by prejudice, discrimination, antagonism, or, notice this, unconscious bias. The outcome might not be caused because somebody intended it at all, but that's not what we're focused on. It's the unconscious bias directed against someone of a different race based on the belief, conscious or unconscious, that one's own race is superior or inferior. Somebody can believe their own race to be inferior and cause a racist outcome. We'll talk more about that later. So, in order to understand why this definition is the one we're going to use in this class, we need to have two concepts in mind. One of them is centering. Centering is making someone or something the focus of the attention. So centering ourselves means that instead of truly listening to someone's experience, we derail or challenge the conversation by sharing our own. That would be an example of centering, if somebody is centering themselves. The other concept we need to understand is really, really important to me. It's so important to me, I literally have it tattooed on my body. Impact is greater than intent. This is the idea that the thing we should be focused on is the impact in the world, not somebody's intentions. So I'll give you an example of centering and impact versus intent. Let's say I was going around just swinging my fist around in the air. And while I'm doing that, I hit somebody in the face. And now they've got a bloody nose. They're a mess. They're tears and blood, and and then somebody says, "Hey, you punched that person." And I say, "But that wasn't my intent. I didn't mean to. I was just swinging my fist around. And now that you've said that I punched them, you're falsely accusing me of doing this on purpose. I'm the victim here because I've been falsely accused, and we all know falsely accusing somebody is harmful, and so I am the one who's now experienced harm." Do you notice who's now centered in this conversation? I've made it all about me, and that person's still bleeding because I hit them in the nose. The impact is that I caused that harm, but I've managed to make it all about my intent. Impact is greater than intent is recognizing the impact in the world is more important. And the person we should be centering on is the person who is harmed. Now, this sounds ridiculous. You'd think no one would do that, right? But it happens all the time. Somebody will do something that is one of those isms, racist, sexist, whatever, and then they will say, "But I didn't mean to." And you'll hear people say, "But I don't have a racist bone in my body. I didn't intend to cause that harm. I didn't mean any offense." What they're doing is taking away the attention from the harm that they caused. So, if we go to our definitions, we look at our contemporary definition, you'll see it focuses not on the intent, but on the outcome, right? What is produced by this belief that somebody is superior or inferior? And that's what we're going to look at in this class. Now, we're going to break it down further. There are 4 different kinds of racism, and you will have to know these. Now, don't worry. As we go through the book, you'll get very familiar with these because we're going to keep coming back to these ideas. Something will happen in the book, and we'll say, which is this an example of? Internalized racism, interpersonal racism, institutional racism, or structural racism? And you'll get good at identifying which they are. But let's introduce these so that we understand what we mean by these. So the first is internalized racism. So and the eye is covered up by the camera there, sorry about that. Internalized racism. This is ideas that one has about one's own race or others' races, which make one feel inferior or superior. So if somebody has heard something and been trained to believe something about their own race, "Oh, we are good at this, we are bad at that," they can harm themselves or elevate themselves in an unfair way based on that belief, even though this isn't something that they might not even be conscious of, but it's on the inside, right? So internalized racism is this idea that a person has about their own race. There's also interpersonal racism. Interpersonal racism are comments or actions between individuals, right? This is out in the world now. It's not just inside. Now this is out in the world. And these are ideas between people that reinforce the ideas that some people are better than others because of their races. These are the most obvious. These are the most visible. And as a consequence, they get the most attention, right? And often to a degree that is really dangerous. Because there was a time I used to say, when I would teach about this, I would say, and these are actually the least common. I'm not sure that's true anymore. I think interpersonal racism, there was a time when it was considered socially unacceptable. And so if somebody would say, "Wow, you're doing that in a really obvious, visible way," people would go, "Oh, no, I'm not," right? And they would try and hide it. I'm worried that we have even lost that. But it created this false impression when it was hidden that racism had gone away. This is just one of the 4 kinds, right? Racism didn't go away. Even when the interpersonal racism was hidden, there was still the internalized racism, and there were still the 2 other kinds all along. This is just the one that people notice, and they notice because it fits with that traditional definition, the intent, right? Did you mean to say that thing out loud? Did you mean to do that thing out in the world, right? But we're not focused on intent. We're focused on outcome, and the outcome can be produced by beliefs people have on the inside, or it could be institutional. Institutional racism are policies or procedures within an organization which favor people based on their race. So I'm going to give you an example of this. There was a school, I believe it was in California. I'm not sure if it was in Oakland or one of the suburbs around Oakland. But I read about this school that put in place a policy that if a student had their cell phone out, and they were caught with their cell phone, they would be suspended for a day. They would lose a day of school, right? And this was, they call it a zero tolerance policy for phones. They were trying to be really strict on phones. And so they put this policy in place. The people who put that policy in place were not sitting around going, ha, 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 let's hurt students of color. That was not intentional. But remember, we don't focus on intent. We focus on outcome. Well, here was the outcome. Here's what actually happened in the real world. The teachers, again, not saying, ha, 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 I want to harm my students of color, but because of unconscious bias, would be going around the room and they would say to a white student, hey, I told you to put your phone away or you're going to get in trouble. Put that phone away because remember, if I send you to the office, you'll get suspended for a day. This is your only warning. And the student would put their phone away. And then they would go to the student of color. And without even knowing they were doing it, they'd say, hey, didn't I already warn you about that? Go to the office. So what ended up happening was lots more students of color were being suspended because of having their phone out. Now, in that one interaction where the teacher says, hey, go to the office, aren't they abiding by the rule? The rule didn't say people get one warning, right? The rule said zero tolerance. So that one interaction doesn't feel like it's in any way exceptional. And the teachers didn't even know they were doing it, but they were giving more warnings to the white students. So the consequence in the real world was that students of color were getting suspended a lot more for the same behavior. That was all happening in the school. That's just in one institution. So that's an example of institutional racism. The fourth kind of racism is structural. Structural racism is policies or procedures of multiple institutions which interact to produce racially biased outcomes. So let's go back to that example of the school. So the school is suspending more students of color than they are suspending white students for the same thing, for having their phones out. Well, meanwhile, this same community put in a rule in place to say, we don't want students to not be in school, to be truant. So if a student is caught by the police out on the streets, they'll be given a ticket if they should be in school during the school day. Anybody under 18 who's out on the streets will be given a ticket. Did the people who put that in place think they were trying to harm people of color? Of course not. They thought it was fair and equal. They were trying to do a good thing. Let's get kids in school. This was not out of intent. But remember, we're not focused on intent. We're focused on outcome. And what actually happened was these police officers who were not bad, the police officers were not going, ha, 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 today I'm going to give more tickets to students of color. Because of the school's policy, now when the police officers were driving around, there were more students of color who had been suspended. And so then the police officers give more of those students tickets. Also, because of our country's history of racism, when white students would get suspended, they were more likely, on average, to be wealthier and therefore have cars. And so they were driving around town. The police weren't pulling them over. Meanwhile, the students of color were walking. So a police officer would see them walking the streets, identify them correctly as being under 18, and give them a ticket. Is that officer trying to be racist? No, but trying is about intent, right? This wasn't about intent. This was structural racism. Now you're saying, okay, so more students of color got a small ticket. Big deal, right? $15 or whatever. Doesn't seem like it's a big deal. But here's what happened. So let's say 2 years later, white student and black student are both at a party together and they're drinking alcohol and the party gets busted. And the police come in and they say, okay, we're arresting everybody, right? We're rounding you all up. And those students then go into court and the judge says, oh, this white student has never gotten a ticket before. You're free to go. Slap on the wrist, don't do it again. You get a warning. and they say to the student of color, "It looks to me like you've received lots of tickets for truancy. You're a bad kid. I'm throwing you in jail." Do you see how these things build up? And that judge doesn't think they're being racist, right? But it's not about intent. It's about systems. It's about structures, right? And so these different structures interacted in such a way that they caused a lot more students of color to end up in jail than white students. Now, there's two ways to understand that when you look at the raw numbers. You can say, well, there are a lot more students of color now in this area who are ending up in jail than there are white students. Either that's the right thing to do because the students of color are inferior, they're bad, they belong in jail, or the system is flawed. The system has structural racism in it. There's no third way to understand that, right? And so understanding structural racism is the only way to explain the phenomena in our world that is the inequity other than racism, right? You can either choose a racist explanation for that reality, or you can recognize that racism is the cause. Okay, so here's one of the criticisms of this. People will say, wait a second, doesn't that make everyone a racist? And I just want to make this clear for the sake of our class. I don't think calling a person a racist is constructive, and we're not going to do that in here. Nobody's going to call anybody a racist. I have slipped before. I may slip again. As we read this book, you are going to read about a character, Bob Ewell, who does things that are so awful, it's very tempting when he's throwing around the N-word to go, oh, he's a racist. But the problem with calling a person a racist is it hides the other kinds of racist behavior. If we're really examining the different kinds of racism, then we need to be able to say, oh, this character, who I like, in fact, maybe even this character who's the hero of the book, is still engaging in racist behavior. So instead of saying a person is a racist, we're going to be focusing on racist behaviors, racist ideas, racist policies. I don't think it's constructive to label a whole person by a behavior. You will hear people who will say, well, this person committed a misdemeanor offense, and therefore they are an illegal. And I just think that's inaccurate and really problematic. That in and of itself is a racist behavior. I have broken the law before. I've had speeding tickets. That's breaking the law. But nobody looked at me and said, well, you broke the law, you're an illegal. So why do we choose one misdemeanor and not one traffic infraction, which is arguably worse, it's a much bigger ticket, right? And say, well, for that, you're an illegal, but for this other thing, which is a much bigger ticket, no, you're not an illegal. It's the same thing with calling a person a racist. It doesn't get at what is the behavior, right? So we're not going to do that in this class. I don't want anybody in here to ever call anybody a racist. And as we read the book, let's avoid that too. We're not going to identify the racist character. Instead, what we're going to be looking at is what is it that the people do that shows us they have racist ideas about themselves, internalized racism, or they exhibit racist behaviors one to another. That's that interpersonal racism. Or they have policies, they have systems within a particular institution that are racist behaviors or racist policies. Or maybe they work in racist systems where different institutions interact to produce racist outcomes. So we're not going to go around describing individuals as a racist. Okay, so let's avoid that. And so instead, and this just gets at that more at that idea. This is from Ibram X. Kendi, who's a professor at Yale, and he literally wrote the book on how to be an anti-racist. What the book's called, How to Be an Anti-Racist. And he says, racism is a marriage of racist policies and racist ideas that produce and normalize racial inequalities. So it's not about calling a person a racist. It's about the policies, the ideas. that produce these inequities. Then he defines that racial inequity is when two or more racial groups are not standing on approximately equal footing. A racist policy is any measure that produces or sustains racial inequity between racial groups. And a racist idea is any idea that suggests one racial group is inferior or superior to another racial group in any way. And again, this video will be up on the class. I know this is a lot of information coming at you very, very fast, but this is, I think, an important thing to understand. We're going to focus on the ideas, the policies, the inequities, rather than who's the person who's bad. That's not useful. Okay, and that brings us back to this idea of the traditional definition of racism, which again focuses on, unfortunately, on intent. But we're not going to do that. We are going to focus on the harm rather than on the person who committed the harm and their intentions. Okay, now, one of the ways this manifests, and we need to know this term because we'll be coming across these in the book too, is microaggressions. So what is a microaggression? Well, according to the Columbia professor Daryl Bling-Sue, microaggression is the brief and commonplace daily verbal, behavioral, or environmental indignities, whether intentional or unintentional, that communicate hostile, derogatory, or negative racial slights and insults toward people of color. These are so tiny and so common that people of color and the people who are exhibiting these behaviors, the people who are committing these microaggressions, aren't aware of them much of the time. They are intentional or unintentional. I'll give you an example of this. I was teaching a group down of adults about combating institutional racism down in Southern Oregon, and somebody got really upset about this idea of microaggressions. They didn't like knowing this. They felt very threatened by this idea. One of the examples of a microaggression I was sharing is that people of color often have this experience when they're walking down the street. White people will move to the other side of the street or like move way around them on the sidewalk, give them a wide berth. And this individual was saying, well, that I find that very, very threatening as an idea, because what if I simply need to make a turn? Am I committing a microaggression? And it was a good opportunity for me to explain, this isn't about your intention, right? This isn't about what you are doing. This is about the lived experience of the person of color. So if the person of color experiences lots of people moving to the other side of the street or moving way to one side on the sidewalk all day long, they don't know. Is that person moving to the other side of the street because they're about to make a turn? Maybe 90 out of 100 times that's why. And maybe the other 10 out of 100 times it's because of my race. And if the person of color doesn't know, then that's this constant worry. And this stress is measurable. We can actually see the effects in the world. This is really interesting, actually. People of color who live in communities that are predominantly of their own racial group experience this stress at a lower level because they're not coming in contact with white people as often. And so we see the effects of this stress most often with people of color who have a lot more interaction with white people. And the consequence, when we can measure this, when we look at these large groups, we can tell that people of color who have a lot of contact with white people and experience these microaggressions all day long have shorter lives. It causes diabetes, it causes heart disease, the constant stress of wondering, is this person treating me this way because of my race? Is really a very, very real health consequence. And this is a consequence for all of us. When people have diabetes, we all end up paying for the person's hospital expenses. This is something we should all want to address, right? Because it's a health concern for all of us when our neighbors are having health problems, right? And yet these are caused by these tiny little microaggressions. And again, no one person is responsible. They're not even aware. In fact, most of the time, if you commit a microaggression, the person who experiences it is not going to say hey, I think that was a microaggression, right? Because what's the benefit? The person who committed microaggression is going to go, but I didn't mean to, right? And they didn't. They were genuinely unaware of it. So why tell the person? But the consequence is the person who committed the microaggression then doesn't know. And they can keep repeating the behavior because they don't know that it caused that stress, right? So where do these microaggressions come from? Well, they come from bias. And we need to know this term as we're reading the book. So bias is believing one thing, person or group, is better than another thing, person or group. So bias isn't necessarily good or bad in and of itself. It doesn't have a moral valence, but most of the time when we use the term, we use it in a negative way. We usually use it when we're saying something is unfair. Now, it's not necessarily wrong. I'll give you an example. I am biased in favor of Cool Ranch Doritos over nacho cheese Doritos. I admit it. That is an explicit, conscious bias of mine. I like Cool Ranch Doritos better, right? And I can even share a conscious bias that relates to people that would be non-controversial. Most people would not disagree. I am biased against people who harm children and animals. I admit it. I am aware of that bias. I am conscious of that bias, right? So most people would say, well, that's a fair bias. But we normally use the term bias to talk about preferences which are unfair. And we all have them. I have them too. So there are two types of bias. There's implicit bias. This is the bias which is not stated out loud, and it might be unconscious. I might have a bias against a group of people and not even be aware of it. Or there's explicit bias. This is the bias which is conscious. When I say to you, I prefer Cool Ranch Doritos to nacho cheese Doritos, that is now an explicit bias. I'm aware of it. I'm stating it in the world, right? Now, these have different effects. We talk about those teachers who were looking at the students with the cell phones. Implicit bias might cause those teachers to say, hey, I'm warning you, put that phone away. Hey, haven't I already given you a warning? Go to the office. They don't even know that they're doing it, right? And we all have these. I have these too, right? And the key thing to do is to take an implicit bias and lift it up, make it explicit so that somebody realizes, oh my gosh, I didn't realize I was doing that. Now that I'm aware that I have that bias, I can watch for it. Wait a second, am I giving some students more warnings than others? I need to be more fair, right? So understanding your biases is not bad. Having biases is not bad. Understanding them so that you can counteract them in the world is a good thing. Oh, I recognize that I have that in me. I need to watch out for that, right? Okay, so when we look at all this, when we look at the way that racism is something that everyone has been trained in and taught in, that we live in these work in these institutions, and we live in these institutions that interact in these structures, it can feel just hopeless, just overwhelming. And it's okay to recognize that. This can be just overwhelming. You could think, we're never going to solve this. This is too big. Activists, that some of my favorite people to read, Austin Channing Brown has this wonderful quote about how some days she just can't get over this and find hope in this. It can be overwhelming. But there is a solution. It's just not a solution that's going to solve the problem in a day. The solution is anti-racism. Anti-racism is the active process of identifying and eliminating racism by changing systems, organizational structures, policies and practices and attitudes so that power is redistributed and shared equitably. It's when people notice, oh, wait a second, this school is suspending more students of color. Oh, wait a second, the police are giving more tickets in this particular suburb of Oakland to students of color. We recognize we need to change this system. That's an anti-racist act. When you acknowledge the system is wrong and you change it, right? And that is the solution. Again, Ibram X. Kendi says the opposite of racist isn't not racist. It's anti-racist. What's the difference? One endorses either the idea of racial hierarchy as a racist or racial equality as an anti-racist. One either believes problems are rooted in groups of people as a racist or locates the roots of problems in power and policies as an anti-racist. One either allows racial inequities to persevere as a racist or confronts racial inequities as an anti-racist. There is no in-between safe space of not racist. Okay, so how are we going to do that in this classroom? We'll have to interrupt. We will have to interrupt bias. And there's two ways you do that, calling out and calling in. So there may be circumstances, as we discuss this book, when we need to say, hey, that thing that you just said as we were discussing the book, that hurt. That was a racist behavior. You need to recognize that. You need to learn from that. And interrupt that so that the harm will stop, right? And those are uncomfortable, but they're necessary. They allow us to stop and stop that racist behavior from continuing. I'll give you an example of this. One time I was in a meeting with some of my colleagues, and I was walking. I left the meeting, and I was walking back down the hall. Back down, when you guys are in the building, you'll see the way our halls are structured. I was walking back down the English hall with one of my colleagues who is himself Native American. And I said about another person in the meeting, whew, she really went off the reservation there, didn't she? And to my friend's credit, to my colleague's credit, he interrupted. And he said, whoa, do you know what that means? Do you know where that comes from? You need to stop. You need to learn this. And I didn't. I realize now, I was reflecting on this, and the only time I'd ever heard that phrase was in movies, and they were always like spy movies. And they would say that about somebody who was like betraying the CIA or something, and they would use it as a metaphor. And so I didn't know the origin of that phrase. And luckily, my friend told me where that phrase comes from. It comes from this idea that if Native American people left the reservation because they're inferior, that was the racist idea, that they would then kill white people. And this racist idea was used as justification to imprison, to harm, even kill Native American people when they would leave their reservations. Well, once I learned that, I was horrified. I will never use that phrase again to describe anybody, but I am very grateful that somebody stopped me and explained what the phrase meant. So, if at any point in this class I feel the need to, or somebody else feels the need to call you out and say, whoa, that thing you said is racist, remember, they are not calling you a racist. They are saying that was a racist phrase or that expresses a racist idea. You may not have even been aware of it. Like me, I did not know that I was using a phrase that was rooted in racism and an idea of superiority and inferiority, right? And so sometimes we have to call those things out, but we're going to try not to. Hopefully, in most situations, we can call in. This is what calling in means. This is an opportunity to explore more deeply, to make meaning together, to find a mutual sense of understanding across difference. So this would be when we are seeking to understand and learn more, when we want to help imagine different perspectives, possibility, or outcomes. And doing so provides multiple perspectives. It encourages us to change our paradigm. That means to change the framework by which we understand the world. It changes our brains. And you know what's perfect for this? Reading fiction. Reading books that are imaginary. They help us imagine different perspectives than our own. Now, this book gives us a perspective which is not perfect for this task, and I'll be really open and honest about that. This book comes from a white person's perspective, and the white author is writing about something that, even though it's fictional, it comes from her own experience when she was a child, and she's fictionalized that. So it's still centering very much on white people. And so this book will not make you an expert in racism. It will make you more understanding of a white person's perspective on learning about how to combat racism. That's a step. That's not the end, right? To Kill a Mockingbird is an introduction. But just learning about fictional people allows us to learn about I mean, these people did not exist, right? You can't hurt them. You can't think the wrong thing about them and harm them in any way. They're fake, right? They're made up. But learning about these fictional people then helps us empathize with real people we meet in the world, because we have learned how to change our perspective, how to see the world through somebody else's eyes, right? Walk around in their shoes for a while. So that's what we're going to hope to do, is more calling in rather than calling out. Okay, I'm going to end here. So this is what we're aiming for. We want to become anti-racists. If this idea of race makes you uncomfortable, if you see that racism is a bad thing in the world, then what you want to become, according to Ibram X. Kendi, is an anti-racist. A lot of times we start off in the fear zone. And that's where somebody says, I don't think racism is a real big deal. I don't really want to talk about this. I avoid hard questions. I just really want to be comfortable. This is uncomfortable for me. Let's not talk about it. I'm just only going to talk to people who already agree with me, who say these other things. And if I only talk to them, then I don't have to deal with this. That's motivated by fear, right? I don't want to deal with this because it's scary. This book will help us move into this learning zone. This is where we say, I recognize racism is a present and current problem. This is a problem right now, right? I seek out questions that make me uncomfortable. I'm having these hard talks. I'm watching this video right now that is uncomfortable. I understand my own privilege in ignoring racism. The fact that I could choose to not have this conversation is in and of itself a privilege. And I'm pushing through that, right? I'm doing it anyway. I'm learning. I'm educating myself about race and structural racism. I'm learning about this even though it's hard. I'm vulnerable about my own biases and knowledge gaps. Maybe I even admit to, this is a time I messed up. This is something I didn't know. And I listen to others who think and look differently than me. I'm willing to read the books by people who look differently than me. I'm willing to, experience, have friends who are different, who will bring different perspectives. That's that learning zone. Here's what we're aiming for, is the growth zone. This is where people say, I identify how I may unknowingly benefit, right? Without even knowing it, there were benefits for me from somebody else's racism, hurting someone else, right? I promote and advocate for policies and leaders that are anti-racist. I'm pushing to change those policies. I sit with my discomfort. I acknowledge that this won't all be over, right? And that's uncomfortable. I can't just solve this and make it go away. That's hard, but that's part of being in this growth zone. I speak out when I see racism in action. I call out and I call in, right? That's tough, but that's the growth zone. I educate my peers how racism harms our profession. This is made obviously for people in the working world, but you all have a profession. You are students, and so if you're in this growth zone, that's helping your peers understand racism is real and learning about them. I don't let mistakes deter me from getting better. I don't say, I messed up and it was really uncomfortable when my colleague pointed out this thing that I said that was racist. I give up. I'm not going to try and be an anti-racist anymore. Being in the growth zone is not giving up and saying, I'm learning from that. I will do better in the future. I'm going to keep going, right? I yield positions of power to those otherwise marginalized. And this means that rather than saying, well, I need to become the expert on this, and then I'm the only one who gets to talk, and I'm not going to cite any other sources, and I'm not going to learn from anybody else. This is saying, I need other people to be informing me. I need to be learning from people who know more than me, right? And when it comes to race, that's going to be people who are people of color, right? Who will be teaching me. And I surround myself with others who think and look differently than me. That's an important part of being in that growth zone. Is it's not just listening. Now it's actually saying, this is my friend group, right? These are the people that I trust. These are the authorities that I look to. The people that you are listening to about race are all of your own race. You're doing it wrong, right? This is looking to people who are different, who will have different perspectives for you on these subjects. So we're going to end the video here and now start the discussion. But I am interested to hear what you think. and we can still use this as a resource as we talk, but I hope that you can see that we are moving in a very positive direction as we go through this, so we're not ending on a hopeless note, even though this has been challenging. So, thank you for your patience, and now on to the discussion.